Could an AI be conscious? Well, if we want to talk about that, then we need to define what we mean by conscious. So I've spoken with some people yesterday and heard a lot of different opinions about what consciousness is, and I want to pick out one specific definition out of those possibilities. What I'm talking about for the purposes of this talk is the quintessentially human type of consciousness. So there's a sense in which a rock is conscious, right? Maybe it has a lower vibrational mode than a person. And that's not what I'm talking about. It wouldn't be an interesting question if that was what I was talking about, because then a spreadsheet program would be conscious. I'm also not talking about consciousness in a sort of cosmic sense that everything's connected to a great, vast amount of information, because that's not specific to humans. I'm talking about the type of thing that we each recognize in each other socially, and that we also recognize through the capabilities that we possess. Being able to introspect, being able to talk with each other and carry on a normal conversation, being able to move our bodies through space gracefully. These types of capabilities is what I'm talking about. And I'm also not talking about certain diminished states that humans get into. So, for example, if you get in your car and you drive from point A to point B, and you sort of zone out, and you don't know what's happening, and you arrive at point B, or maybe point C, and you don't know what happened, that type of consciousness is not what I'm talking about either. Maybe we have some self-driving cars that get close to that already. I'm talking about the rarefied heights of human consciousness, the types of things that people can do that we all recognize as really special and really part of humanity. I spoke with some people, and what's an example of this type of thing? One person said the Dalai Lama sitting down and meditating, that type of thing, or someone writing a sonnet. These types of things. It's hard to pin it down precisely, but you sort of know it when you see it. So that's the type of consciousness that we're talking about. And I'd like to do a short straw poll here and say, do you think an AI, an artificial intelligence, could have that type of uniquely human mode of consciousness? How many of you think so? Raise your hand up if you think that that's the case, that in principle an AI could do that. All right, so it looks like maybe 2 to 5% of the audience thinks that that's possible in principle. So the point of this talk is to share a thought experiment with you, an example of one specific type of AI that I think does meet those stringent criteria. And I hope that this thought experiment will be something you take with you outside that you can use as you're thinking about these complex questions in the future. It's a rather absurd AI. It's not something I think is necessarily practical or something that will actually be done, but it's very clarifying, because anything you want to say about AIs in general needs to apply to this specific AI. It's a single page. That's all the code that it has, and a vast amount of data. And here's how it works. So imagine this situation of the Dalai Lama sitting and meditating, or replace it with your preferred, high type of consciousness that a human's performing. And zoom in, all right? So this person is built out of 30 trillion cells. And the cells are vastly complicated structures that carry on the business of life. They have an immense array of biomolecules. They grow, they divide, they move ions, they have an inside and outside, very complex structures. Zoom in even further. Now, as you've zoomed in more, you see a sea of proteins and other molecules that are not themselves alive. They mindlessly move from the motions of physics, and everything that they do is rigorously defined by diffusion chemistry, by biochemistry. A protein randomly moves around as stuff knocks into it. If it happens to find some sort of substrate that it can bind to and maybe catalyze a reaction, it does. Otherwise, it just keeps moving around. Same thing for the nucleic acids. Same things for the lipids that create the boundary between self and other. Same thing for the carbohydrates. All of these things are moving around. They're not themselves alive, and their motions are defined very rigorously. It's just physics at this level. And it is a truly vast level. You have 30 trillion cells. Every cell's got about 1 billion proteins in it, and they move fast. You can catalyze thousands of reactions a second. It's almost inconceivable the scale at which this exists. And together, this constitutes the person that's sitting and meditating. And although it's vast, it's still finite. 30 trillion times 1 billion is still a finite number. Even if you want to multiply it by 100 or 1,000-fold on top of that, it's still a finite number. All of that could still fit inside computer memory. So imagine an AI that is simply a snapshot of a person, down to the molecular level. And next to that snapshot, you have a page of code that says, this is biochemistry. These are the rules of how these molecules move around. And all it does is it takes the snapshot, and then it runs these update rules on it. If a protein's here and it has a velocity like that, it moves a tick forward. A protein's here and it's close enough for a chemical reaction to happen, it makes a chemical reaction happen. And you just run that in a loop over and over and over and over again. Well, then the causality, the internal causality of that program is going to be identical to the functioning of that person. And so if there is an action potential that fires in these neurons, which itself is a vast agglomeration of the functions of all the constituent molecules, if that happens in the living one, it happens in the simulated one. And the action potentials come together, and they eventually cause thoughts to happen, or the type of non-thoughts that you might be having while you're meditating. But that pattern of activity will be the same between the two. And so I would assert that this type of AI, this specific absurd example, is conscious the way we recognize other humans to be conscious. Do whatever test you'd like. You can talk with this person, and you'll get intelligible words back. Ask them to perform some of the actions they're able to do that the template's based off of. They can do those actions. The analogy here that I like to use is one of a book. A person could be like a vast, complex tome written in a language that you can't read. And it tells a vast and powerful story, and it has something of great significance to it. And even if you can't read, even if you can't appreciate the plot of the story, or if you can only appreciate it in the smallest degrees to which you learned how to appreciate it, if you're willing to take out a pen and take a blank book and faithfully copy every single little symbol and glyph, each little curve, each little line, and do it correctly, and do it for the entire book, then you will have succeeded in copying the book. And if you then hand that book that you copied, and you hand it to someone who does know that language, that can read it, they can open the book and they can receive that story that the original author penned that was originally in the book that you copied. And so you're doing a similar type of thing to the person. You don't need to understand how consciousness works or how the high levels of the system works. All you have to do is understand the lowest levels of how the system works and understand enough about the lowest levels of the system to know that it's a complete enough description to transmit the important things about that system to the copy or to the simulation. So it's very impractical, of course. Do I think that this type of AI is going to actually be built and actually work? No, it's incredibly complicated. But on the other hand, if you've shown a single thing can practically work, now you know that the space of AIs contains one particular type of AI that's conscious. And even if that particular AI is not practical, you could imagine tweaks to it that make it more practical. Maybe you don't have to simulate every single protein. Maybe simulating the neurons in a much more toy-like manner is enough. And you may imagine that you could eventually build something that would work. So that's the main example that I wanted to communicate. And I wonder now if we could do another poll. How many of you think that that AI in particular would be able to perform these types of actions that the person that it was based off of, the snapshot was based off of, could perform? Raise your hand if you think that it would be able to do that. Looks like maybe 5 times, 6 times as many people as before. And so there's your one AI. Again, I don't think we're necessarily going to build that, but it's compelling that before you thought there was no way it could be done. And maybe that's more of a lack of imagination rather than it being an intrinsic properties of AI themselves. Now, there's a few follow-up questions. What about quantum mechanics? Well, quantum mechanics is computable, although it certainly adds a lot of work to this type of situation. But it's already absurd to begin with, so we can add that on without any particular theoretical trouble. Question 2, what about the environment? You know, if you've just taken a snapshot of a person, but they're trapped in a void, then they're not capable of doing certain things that a person would be able to do because a person's embedded in their environment, and the environment matters. But that's not really much of an issue either, because if you're simulating a person, you can certainly simulate a room, a building, a continent. It's really not that hard compared to the complex biochemistry of a person. So you can have a person and you can have environment. Or you could have 20 people at once. Why not? Those are the main objections, but that's kind of the core that I wanted to communicate. If you leave with that example, then that's my job done. And if you want to talk some more about it, I will be in the Agora. It's been a pleasure to speak with all of you.